Uh, Good afternoon and a very, very warm welcome to this webinar series being organized by Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. Today we have the pleasure of having with us Dr. Rita Banerjee, fellow at NMML. She is speaking on visions of the East in the 20th century, Rabindranath Tagore and Japan. We know that the ideas of the East and the West both originated in the last few hundred years, especially in the last 3 centuries, one might say, in a certain specific historical context dominated by colonialism and imperialism. When the West was able to conquer what it described as the rest of the world or as the East, the people living in those societies also started thinking more and more in terms of being Eastern people or in terms of representing the East. So one might argue that the East and West were obverse images of each other, which came into context came into existence in the modern times in a certain specific historical context. This does not mean, of course, that there were no historical distinctions between the classical civilizations of India, China, Japan, Europe, and Islam, for example, in the earlier centuries. However, the clear demarcation between the East and the West, in which the European civilization came to be regarded as the West, and all others towards the East came to be regarded as the East, is something that crystallized only in the last few centuries. And therefore, visions of the East also started developing and crystallizing in India, in China, in Japan, and in many other parts of what came to be described as the Eastern world. And these visions were shared by a variety of leaders, intellectuals, writers, poets in these countries. India was, needless to say, one of the leading countries which had many important thinkers of this kind who thought of India as an Eastern country and who wanted to sort of forge some kind of a unity between all Eastern countries, including most importantly India, China, and Japan. Now, Rabindranath Tagore, the great poet, writer, artist, visionary, you can probably say was probably the patron saint of this vision of the East in India, and he made important visits to many countries in Asia, and he wanted to do his bit to forge this pan-Asian unity, if I can put it that way. As far as I remember, he visited Japan 3 times in 1916, 1924, and 1929. Of course, he was sort of impressed by Japanese art, culture, etc. But the underlying idea behind Tagore's efforts in the case of his visits to Japan, more than anything else, was to forge that Asian unity which I have been talking about. So his visits to Japan, his interactions with Japan, and the Japanese reactions to them constitute one of the most fascinating chapters in the history of India in the early half of the 20th century. Now, without anticipating our speaker, I will stop here and request her to proceed with her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead. Please start, Dr. Banerjee. We can hear you.
This paper, I examine Rabindranath Tagore's concept of the East and the West and their potential for complementing each other in in the context of contemporary Asian and Western thought, and the connection between such ideas and his evolving experience in Japan, a non colonized, scientifically advanced Asian nation. According to Tagore, there was a clear divide between the essence of Asian and Western thoughts. The concept of Asian as characterized by spiritualism and Western as representing aggressive materialism. However, multiple variants of such ideas related to the East and the West existed at the time not only in India but in other Asian nations and the West, and Tagore might have derived his ideas from them. Can you turn on slide 2, please? Slide 2, please. According to Stephen Hay, the According to Stephen Hay, the origin of these ideas lay in the Orientalist school of thought elaborated by European scholars of the East. Initiated by Warren Hastings, the first phase of the Orientalist movement, comprising of William Jones, H.T. Colebrook, Jonathan Duncan, etc., sought to rediscover the treasures of Indian literature. They aimed to establish the superiority of Asian and especially Indian civilization in an early period. Quote, in some early age, they, the Hindus, were splendid in arts and arms, happy in government, wise in legislation, and eminent in various knowledge. This early unquote. This early notion of Orientalism also claimed that far from being introspective and
Dr. Banerjee, we cannot hear you
oh
clearly. Is
no,
there a problem with your connection?
Vedic period
We
resembles
can't hear you
several
clearly.
Indian social reformers, intellectual thinkers, and
No, Dr. Banerjee, we cannot hear you clearly.
people like Ram Mohan Roy and Keshav Chandra Sen had expressed ideas regarding the East. Huh?
We can't hear you clearly. Yeah, we can
Can
hear
I?
you now,
Can you
but
hear
it
me
has
now?
it has been interrupted line. So can you repeat? Can you go
Regard,
back 2 3 minutes?
huh? Okay.
We couldn't hear you.
I talked about William Jones, the Orientalist school of thought of William Jones, H.T. Colebrook, and Jonathan Duncan. How they saw the East as but outgoing and non-mystical. And in contrast to the Orientalism, 19th century Orientalism, this view was more universalist and rationalist. Now, I go on to people like Ram Mohan Roy and Keshav Chandra Sen had expressed ideas regarding the East in various public in Calcutta in 1883. Sen made a distinction between Europe as rich in scientific discoveries, literature, and political home of all the religions of the world. He Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Zoroastrianism. The great religions which have given life and salvation to millions of men owe their origin to Asia. This is within quotes. However, in sense view, Asia does not contain
Hi, this is Suparna. Uh, I think, can you turn off your video? You might be able to save on bandwidth. Could the moderator please request the speaker to turn off the video? That will help you save on bandwidth so you'll be more audible.
trip to the Chicago World Parliament of Religions in 1893 and the exposition of Hinduism to an enthusiastically admiring American audience won him fame and interest grew in Asian religions. Similarly, trying to distinguish the Roman, the Classical Western tradition from the Indian spiritual and religious traditions. Am I audible? I don't know what's happening. Okay, I hope I'm audible. I'm just going on. But say like, okay. Vivekananda's very successful trip to the Chicago World Parliament of Religions in 1893 and exposition of Hinduism to an enthusiastically admiring American audience won him fame and interest grew in Asian religions. In his speech before the Los Angeles audience in 1900, Vivekananda equated India's spirituality with the essence of Eastern or Asian civilization. The voice of Asia has been the voice of religion. The voice of Europe is the voice of politics. Each is great in its own sphere. Similarly, trying to distinguish the Roman, the classical Western tradition from the Asian, Vivekananda's well known Irish disciple Margaret Noble, later known as Sister Nivedita, wrote, Wherever the seed of India has been blown, it has grown up into world faiths. Wherever the seed of Rome has fallen, it has raised up mighty nations. Unquote. The materialistic advancement of Europe contrasted with the spiritual and religious, with the spiritual and the religious and Asia. Tagore's ideas regarding the East and the West evidently derived from these older and contemporary reformers and thinkers. Later Orientalists like Friedrich Max Müller, the first professor of comparative philology at Oxford, also very influentially spread the idea of philosophical heritage and spiritual ascendancy of India to the West. As an Indologist, Max Müller generated interest in the study of Indian religion and the Vedic culture of India, translated the Rig Veda, and championed Sanskrit language and literature. His work on the Upanishads and the Vedas served to show the spiritual wealth of Hinduism. Um, it would be wrong to say, however, as he does, that the discovery of the spiritual wealth of India was merely the byproduct of Occidental or Orientalist research. And Tagore essentially assimilated these ideas from Western thinkers. For instance, Sri Aurobindo, in his discussion of the Renaissance in India, concedes that India, which had lapsed into a torpor of the creative spirit in religion and art, science, and philosophy, during the 18th century received an impetus of reawakening in contact with the spirit of the West. However, India did not imitate the West. In his view, quote, the spiritual power of the Indian mind remains supreme, recovers its truths, accepts whatever it finds sound or true, and so transforms it entirely into itself that its foreign character disappears. Tagore's acquaintance with the religious thoughts of the East was therefore homegrown. However, his inquiry into Eastern thoughts in countries like Japan, and now I go on to the third slide, slide number 3. And China and his many visits to these countries suggest a desire to find a common thread linking the Eastern countries, which would stand as a barrier to the encroaching, exuberant materialism and warmongering of the Western countries, and to an extent, a story of disillusionment also. The relation between Tagore and Japan must needs include a reference to the thoughts of Kakuzo or Okakura Tenshin, and his book The Ideals of the East, 1903, which appeared like a revelation to many educated Indians. Now, Tagore's acquaintance with the Japanese visitor to India played an important role in the development of his idea of Pan-Asian unity of thought, religious ideals, and art. Okakura in his book speaks of the concept of Asian unity. Quote, Asia is one, the Himalayas divide, only to accentuate two mighty civilizations, the Chinese with its communism of Confucius and the Indian with its individualism of the Vedas. But not even the snowy barriers can interrupt for one moment that broad expanse of love for the ultimate and the universal, which is the common thought inheritance of every Asiatic race, enabling them to produce all the great religions of the world. Uh, Unquote. This is a clear articulation of Asia as one instead of various national, racial, and territorial bifurcations. Okakura Kakuzo was an authority on Japanese art and art history in his country. At a young age, he had been made a member of the Imperial Art Commission, which the Japanese government sent to Europe and the US to study Western art and the European movements in art history in 1886. But contact with Western art served only to deepen his interest in Asian art. And on his return, he advised the strengthening and growth of national art in Japan instead of imitating Western art. He soon became the director of the new art school in Ueno, Tokyo, but resigned in protest in 1890 because it was insisted that European methods should become increasingly prominent. I would ask for slide 4, please. Okakura discovered similarities in Asian arts and talked in his book about the dominant influence of Buddhism spreading from India that inspired both Chinese and Japanese art. The similarities between and mingling of Eastern cultures and art is the central theme of his book. In the Ideals of the East, he describes the spiritual, intellectual, and sometimes even scientific aspects of each period, often relating them to the specificities of Buddhist art. Okakura argues that Buddhist art in India grew out of the art of that of the epic age of Mahabharata and Ramayana, which depicted or alluded to storied towers, galleries of pictures, unquote, and statues of human figures, and therefore could not be lacking in image worship. For descriptive literature concerning the forms of gods meant correlative attempts at plastic actualization. In the stone bases of statues covered with paste or plaster, Kakuzo finds the influence of ancient Asiatic art, like that of Mesopotamia, China, and Persia, rather than ancient Greece. In the Nara period, 700 to 800 AD, Okakura sees the resurgence and development in Buddhist thought, representing a union of matter and spirit, exemplified in the mingling of spirit with matter, best shown in the appearance of calm and the harmony of proportions that one witnesses in the Buddhas of Tintal in Ellora, which inspired Tang and Nara sculptures in China and Japan. This movement spread across Asia. The quote, for the moment, spirit was seeking union with matter, and the joy of the first embrace was to ring from Ujjain to Puan and Nara through the song of Kalidasa, of Ritai Haku, and of Hitomaru. Unquote. Significantly, Sister Nivedita had helped Kakuzo in his conception and design of the book, and strengthened the argument that it was Indian influence which was supremely dominant in the Buddhist art in the three countries. Nivedita saw the spirit of synthesis in Okakura's book as especially important. Quote, therefore, it of supreme value to show Asia as Mr. Okakura does, not as the congeries of geographical fragments that we imagine, but as a united living organism, each part dependent on all the others, the whole breathing a single complex life. Unquote. Inaga Shigemi argues that in this united living organism, Nivedita found what she called the all-pervasive syncretic force, which would realize the Indian synthesis under the guidance of modernized Hinduism. Clearly, Okakura's slogan, Asia is One, was ready to exercise a direct political impact upon the aspirations for national unity in the subcontinent. Shigemi argues that Okakura, like Ananda Kumaraswamy, sought to explain Asiatic art as solely the dissemination of Indian philosophy. The distinction was between plastic art in the West and spiritual art in the East. Whatever might be the inaccuracies of Okakura, his ideas had cast great influence on Tagore and his conception of the East. When he paid a tribute to to Okakura in his Tokyo lecture on Oriental culture in Japan's mission. Tagore says there, some years ago, I had the real meeting with Japan when a great original mind from these shores came in our midst. He was a great guest for a long time, and he had immense inspiration for the young generation of Bengal in those days, which immediately preceded a period of a sudden ebullition of national self assertion in our country. The boys of the East came from him to our young men, and he asked them to make it their mission in life to create a great expression of the human spirit worthy of the East. He said that if they could maintain a simple attitude of worshipful mind towards great external ideas, which is the East, they would be able to summon up the strength to suffer martyrdom in their aspiration for a glorious future. The excitement and satisfaction that Okakura's visit produced was followed by the visit of artists Yoko Yomataikan and Hishida Shanso, who came to discuss ideas and techniques of artistry with Govindranath Tagore and Abanindranath Tagore. A young man, Buri, came to study Sanskrit at Shantiniketan, and Tagore even asked for Japanese teachers for teaching judo and the Japanese language. In this connection, I would like to refer to Ernest Penalosa, who was Kakuzo's teacher, who also held a view of Asian unity. But his view of Asian unity was significantly different from his student Kakuzo as well as Tagore. Actually, it was about the fusion of East and the West. In an article published in the Harper's New Monthly magazine in 1898, Penalosa had envisaged a political union between England and Japan in 1896 to keep Russia out. Quote, if China has given Russia pledges that virtually undermine her, the last hope is England. She, that means England, cannot afford to see Japan worsted in a contest that will make the North Pacific a Russian lake. The very gates of India would tremble. It would be the self-abdication of Anglo-Saxon race. For if there is a threat to civilization, it is from the Muscovite. Unquote. Now, not only does Penalosa's statement savor of racism, he refers to Asiatic hordes, denigration of the Muscovites, and the East European races. He talks of a union of political powers of diplomacy and military aggression, things which were almost anathema to Tagore. In effect, Penalosa advocates Japanese aggression against China, suggesting that after 25 years of forbearance, Japan had no alternative but to bring her big bullying brother to his senses. So, although Penalosa was his teacher, Kakuzo's idea of one Asia was perceptibly different from this. Now, Tagore's ideas were, of course, very akin to Kakuzo and very dissimilar to Penalosa's. So, I would request slide 5, please. Tagore's visit to Japan and his travelogue. Even before his visit was in 1916, even before his visit to Japan, Tagore had set out what he wanted and expected to discover in Japan. In a letter to Kimura Nikki, a Japanese scholar at Calcutta University in 1915, he had written, I want to know Japan in the outward manifestation of its modern life and in the spirit of its traditional past. I also want to follow the traces of ancient India in your civilization and have some idea of your literature if possible. Unquote. On the way to Japan, Tagore sought to find commonness in the friendliness and the familiarity of the ship's crew, as opposed to the distant and formal behavior of European crew in general. Similarly, his interactions with the individual Japanese people produced a positive effect. Tagore admired the Japanese character, their art, and sense of beauty. He discovered the strength of Japan in the quietness and reserve of the people in the face of provocation. The Japanese reserve their strength for their work without much waste. In art, they express themselves with a few words. On an invitation to tea, Tagore went to a garden house of his host where he perceived the beauty and peace of the Japanese garden. What especially struck the poet was the limited furniture in the rooms, unlike in most houses in India, where things are crowded in the living room for display, flaunting the wealth of the host. The poet found in the Japanese arts of tea making, flower arrangement, dancing, literary as well as pictorial arts, and their day-to-day living, the concession and restraint which lies at the root of their love of beauty. The same taste for restraint and invitation it offered to imagination that he had referred to in their poetry, he discovered in their painting as well. At this point in the travelogue Japania 3, Japan Jatri. Tagore praised Japan for her mastery of the secrets of European industry, warfare, and law within a very short time. According to him, Japan's achievement reflects the dynamic nature of their society. Quote, the moment the idea entered their head, they did not wait even one moment. In a few years, Japan appropriated the power of Europe. By the magic of an Aladdin's lamp, she brought Europe's guns and cannons, soldiers, marches, machines and factories, offices and courts, laws and regulations from the Western world and installed them in the Eastern Hemisphere. Unquote. By contrast, India, in Tagore's view, was a static society then, which took long to get out of its stagnation, its age-old traditions, without being able to move along. However, his actual experience of Japan conveyed to him the growing spirit of materialism in Japan, and there are signs of dissatisfaction. He cautioned, even in the midst of his praises for Japan in the travelogue, he says that despite her scientific achievements, Japan seems to lack a certain moral ideal and spirituality, which is necessary as a guiding principle of a nation. He concludes his travelogue by saying that the current Japanese society had only one flaw in its building of skill and expertise. Success was its chief wealth, and nationalist self interest was its god. Spirituality has ceased to matter, and that is why the German philosopher Nietzsche was their favorite. Um, as the travelogue progresses, Tagore's disappointment and disillusionment with Japan's Western leanings become evident. We would need to examine his experiences and reception in Japan to understand how Japan belied the expectation aroused by Kakuzu. But the travelogue indicates that the poet has not replicated the stereotypical distinction between the East and the West without recognizing the various nuances of specific cultures and tendencies. Go on to slide 6, please. Tagore's speeches and his reception in Japan. Tagore received an enthusiastic welcome in Japan during his first visit because he was the first Asian to have won the Nobel Prize, a great honor from the Western world. His landing in Kobe, as he has described in Japan Yatri, seemed to have generated a human cyclone, which obviously displeased him. Little did the Japanese realize that he would decry Western society and its achievements in his speeches. His first speech at a meeting in Osaka, which was organized by the Osaka Asahi Rising Sun newspaper, was attended by a 3,000 strong crowd. His topic was India and Japan, and he talked at length of the evils of modern civilization which had captured Japan. Quote, the whirlwind of modern civilization has caught Japan as it has caught the rest of the world. What I see before me is the temple of the modern age, where before the brazen images an immense amount of sacrifice is offered and an interminable round of ritualism is performed. Unquote. He sought to find the real Japan because what he saw then was not Japan. I quote, I must seek and find what is true in this land, true to the soul of the people. What is Japan? What is unique? And not merely the mask of the time, which is monotonously the same in all latitudes and longitudes. Unquote. Tagore's critique of the evils of Western civilization and Japan's strides in industrial development was misconstrued by the Japanese as a critique of scientific achievement and civilization. In fact, science and civilization, that's how it was a critique of science and civilization, that's how they view it. Tokyo Asahi reported with a pungent heading, Tagore curses civilization. In his subsequent lectures in Tokyo, Tagore similarly decried industrialization and talked of the fraternity of Eastern nations. In The Message of India in Japan, Tagore talked of how Asia had held the torch of civilization while the West slumbered in darkness. Unquote. Beginning quote. When the whole of Eastern Asia, from Burma to Japan, was united with India in the closest tie of friendship. While the lamp of civilization in ancient Greece is extinct, the civilization whose basis is society and the spiritual ideal of man is still a living thing in China and in India. Eastern Asia has been pursuing its own path, evolving its own civilization, which was not political but social, not predatory and mechanically efficient, but spiritual and based upon all the varied and deeper relations of humanity. Unquote. Since Japan had already successfully acquired the benefits of modern civilization from Europe, she was supremely able to lead an Asian regeneration. But Japan should not allow the scientific paraphernalia to transform her into a borrowed machine. Instead, she should apply her Eastern mind, her spiritual strength, love of simplicity, recognition of social obligation, in order to cut out a new path for this great unwieldy car of progress. Unquote. He appealed to Japan, quote, "We offer our thanks to this land of the rising sun and solemnly ask her to remember that she has the mission of the East to fulfill. She must infuse the sap of a fuller humanity into the heart of modern civilization." The idea of Japan leading a pan-Asian group of nations appealed to the Japanese. To that extent, the speech was welcome. However, there was much in it which displeased them as well. In an interview to Manchester Guardian during his stay in Tokyo, Tagore again spoke of Japan leading the Asian nations. Quote, "Japan cannot stand alone. She would be bankrupt in competition with a united Europe, and she could not expect support in Europe. It is natural that she should seek it in Asia in association with a free China, Siam, and perhaps in the ultimate course of things, a free India. Of course, this is to look a long way ahead, and there are many obstacles in the way, notably in the absence of a common language and the difficulty of communication. But from Siam to Japan, there are, I believe, kindred stocks, and from India to Japan, there is much of religion and art and philosophy, which is a common possession." Unquote. This, as Stephen Hay rightly points out, has political overtones. But the poet seems to suggest here that he meant a pan-Asian collective. The commonness in social systems, values, and principles, religious similarities, and the need to stand against the evils of colonial and imperialistic politics could unite Asian nations. And since Japan was free from the colonial shackles, Tagore felt Japan was eminently qualified to lead such a collective. He suggested that the Buddhist spirit of Maitri lay at the bottom of his envisioned unity in Asia. Later, at the invitation of private colleges, he delivered a talk on the spirit of Japan, where he similarly denounced nationalism as an imitation of the West and an evil brought in by Western civilization. He defined modernism as, quote, "freedom of mind, not slavery of taste. It is independence of thought and action, not tutelage under European schoolmasters. It is science, but not its wrong application in life." Unquote. His view of science led to some misunderstanding. Before going back in an interview, he further explained that science was like a razor, which should be used by human beings, who should not be used by it. Please go on to slide 7. Significantly, some of his audience admired his presence as an Indian sage and listened to what seemed to them a melodious speech. But when the speeches were translated for them, they lost interest or criticized them. In Japan, his speeches were welcomed by some Buddhists, Christians, and women. He found much peace and pleasure in associating with the young schoolgirls in a mountain resort, whose gift of a photo album is one of the cherished possessions in the archives of Shantiniketan. Curiously, his speeches reported in Europe generated praise from philosophers and pacifists like Romarola, despite the critique of Western nationalism. Some Western educated poets and men of letters in Japan, like Yone Nobuchi, also appreciated Tagore. Nobuchi wrote in the Modern Review, quote, "When he declared the spirit of the Western civilization to be poisoning the very fountainhead of humanity and advocated that Japan should have a firm faith in the moral law of existence, clear of the path of suicide of Western nations, and spoke of the common spiritual heritage of the whole of Eastern Asia, from Burma to Japan. The large nation audience who were listening to him distinctly divided into two opinions. While some adherents of the so-called
Dr. Banerjee, if I may interrupt, sorry, you have
yes,
5 more minutes, please.
um, But you see, I began 10 minutes later because there was so
All
much
right,
trouble.
all right. 10 more minutes.
5
Please go
more
ahead.
minutes, 10 minutes more.
10 minutes. But
Thank
yeah, please go ahead.
While some adherents of the so-called Western civilization in Japan called Sir Rabindranath merely a propagandist of negativism or willful dreamer who, in spite of himself, will surely fail to realize the fullness of his own nature. The others delightfully awakened into the so-called uh, Japanism or Orientalism, endorsed by the exposed weakness of the present European war, thought that Sir Rabindranath agreed with their first principle in encouraging the real individualism to assert the inner development of the nation. Unquote. Noguchi largely sums up the two groups which misunderstood Tagore, one discarding him completely, the other, the chauvinists who abhorred the West, pleased with his message for the wrong reason. He rightly suggests that Tagore raises an important question without offering an answer. Quote, how can we keep our own beauty and strength, grown from the soil 1,000 years old, and let them realize the fullness of their nature, not curtailing all that is best and true in them at the threatened encroachment of foreign elements? At the threatened encroachment of foreign elements. Unquote. According to Noguchi, Tagore raised this question in the well-balanced Japanese intellectual minds. Belonging to the first group, Kuroiwa Shuroku, the publisher of Yorotsu Choho, Universal News, accused Tagore of resignationism. The writer Mushoku Saneatsu thought Tagore's Orientalism was dispensable. I think we can adopt more important things from the teachings of the West, which are hard to understand and take time to fathom, than from the teachings of the Orient, which we already know too well. Besides, he pertinently pointed out that Tagore had said nothing about deriving benefits for all humankind from materialism. A socialist writer like Ogawa Mimei offered a different kind of criticism, accusing Tagore of being unrealistic because of his aristocratic background. Quote, to be a true artist, one must have experienced the feelings of the poor, unquote. As expected among political leaders, Tagore found no following. The growth of nationalism and technological development of Japan, as well as the increase in material prosperity, made Tagore's message unacceptable to the contemporary Japanese. While Tagore was on the quest of finding the real Japan, it is difficult to say whether what he sought could be found. On his second tour in 1924, Tagore repeated most of what he had said earlier in 1916 in his lectures held at Osaka, Tokyo, and Kyoto. But he joined in the Japanese protest against a racist ban on immigration from Japan by the US. This pleased even many ultra-nationalists in Japan. On his last visit in 1929, however, he aroused their anger by criticizing Japan's imperial aggression against Korea and also Japan's policy in China. Please go on to slide 8. He was finally completely alienated from Japan at her conquest of Manchuria in 1931 and invasion of China in 1937. During the Second World War, he had fully realized that the Pan-Asian unity that he had envisioned with Japan in the lead was never to be. During the Second World War, all humanity was under attack, and the concept of Asian or European unity broke down completely. The war called into question such concepts. Tagore found that Japan was no different from the colonialist West and was, in fact, an ally of fascist Germany. A sizable section of the Japanese was certainly not averse to imperialism and would compete with Western powers for empire building. Significantly, even Noguchi, who had praised Tagore on occasions and visited Shantiniketa, where he was welcomed enthusiastically, wrote to Tagore in 1937 July, contradicting the latter's view of the Sino-Japanese War. Quote, but if you take the present war in China for the criminal outcome of Japan's surrender to the West, you are wrong, because not being a slaughtering madness, it is, I believe, the inevitable means, terrible it is though, for establishing a new great world in the Asiatic continent, where the principle of live and let live has to be realized. Believe me, it is the war of Asia for Asia. Unquote. Tagore obviously did not appreciate this. On 20th September 1939, in an open letter to Umyo Chakraborty, he wrote that the powerful and rapacious have always killed and victimized the weak in human history. As in early days, raiders from the middle of Asia spread countless human skeletons along their path of brigandage, and Christian clergymen acquired religious credit by massacres of non-Christians. Similarly, he said, I saw with a sorrowful heart the ministers of state of the great imperial power were idly watching Japan with its cruel jaws, snatching and devouring China. And at the end, they accepted such insult at Japan's hand, that which had never happened in the throne of their Western empire. In the name of friendship, they aided Germany in reducing to dust Czechoslovakia with its boots, and let Abyssinia disappear in the yawning mouth of Italy. After strengthening the hands of the enemy at each step, today they have to launch a great war. I wish wholeheartedly that England and France may win the war, because I cannot endure the blot of fascism and Nazism in the history of humankind. But Tagore's sympathy lay with the helpless China, which lacked unlimited money and means, like the imperial powers have. Even as far as Japan's concept of one Asia is concerned, there were many who disagreed from it. Even earlier, Fukuzawa Yukichi had published an essay which he called Datsuron on saying goodbye to Asia, which has been numerously translated as escaping from Asia, leaving Asia, or de-Asianization. As okay, he talked about we do not have to time. He says we do not have time to wait for the enlightenment of our neighbor, so that we can work together toward the development of Asia. It is better for us to leave the rank of Asian nations and cast our lot with the civilized nations of the West. After the attack, so in the light of this, we cannot, it would be natural that they would attack, they would invade China in 1937. Now, after the attack on France, Tagore had wired to President, in the Second War, Tagore had wired to President Roosevelt to save the world. All our individual problems of politics today have merged into one supreme politics, which I believe is seeking the help of the United States of America as the last as the last refuge of the spiritual man. That she, that is the US, will not fail her mission to stand against the universal disaster that appears so imminent. Unquote. Ironically, the US fulfilled its role as the last refuge of the spiritual man in Tagore's words by dropping the atom bomb on the two Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which killed millions. Tagore did not live to see the destruction let loose by the Allied European and American forces. But the Peace Memorial Museum in central Hiroshima today represents a belief and a hope which might remind us of Tagore's ideals. Quote, having now recovered from the A-bomb calamity, Hiroshima's deepest wish is the elimination of all nuclear weapons and the realization of a genuinely peaceful international community. In Tagore's letters during the Second War, we do not get any suggestions of the unity of the East. In joining cause with Abyssinia, East European countries like Czechoslovakia, Poland, Bulgaria, which he had visited and received much love from, and even the less aggressive North European countries like Denmark, Norway, Belgium, which fell to Hitler's Nazi army, as well as China, which was confronting the same imperial power with a different name. Tagore found an affinity between European, Asian, and African nations in their relation to the cause of justice and policy of aggression. Today's situations have changed. If self-interest drove Japan to attack China before the Second War, then China's imperialistic endeavors today threaten a host of Southeast Asian nations, among them Japan, India, South Korea, etc. One wonders how relevant the concept of one Asia would be in today's India or Asia. The issue of identity has many variants. As Rustam Bharucha says, if one accepts that identities are not unchanging, but rather are constructions that are shaped in and through larger discourses, then one must emphasize the absence of such an Asian discourse in the contemporary India. Unquote. To reassess the relevance of Tagore's ideal of the East, we would need to remember that Tagore's conception of the East pertained to people rather than the state. On his visits to Western countries, Tagore believed that he was carrying the message of the East. His visits were motivated by a desire to build unity and fraternity among the people of the East. Tagore's East was a vision of what the Eastern nations had stood for from olden times, a spirit of harmony, peace, and spirituality. He incorporated this vision in the World University that he created in Shantiniketan. In today's world of globalization and universal commercialization, it would be difficult to say that the East represents spirituality and the West materialism. And the concept of one Asia has lost its validity in view of rivalries and aggressions among different Asian nations. But what Tagore believed the East stood for, namely the spirit of amity, peace, and harmony among people, still endures as an ideal, not divorced from materialism perhaps, but coexisting alongside it. That's it. The last slide, please. Thank you for listening. I'm afraid I can't hear you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Banerjee, for your insightful lecture on the subject. Um, uh, if there is any question from the audience, it's welcome.
I have a question, Doctor. Thank you so much for your presentation. This is Suparna. I actually did find something very interesting in what you said was the variant reception of Tagore's speeches, and you talked about Buddhists, Christians, and women. You know, looking at them positively. Why do you believe women? I can understand Buddhists. Why would you believe that women would have received his speeches positively? And do you think it has something to do with maybe women blaming the patriarchal society in Japan at that time on Western influence? Or would it be something completely different?
Thank you very much for the question. Yes, actually, it would have, women in Tagore's view were people who had empathy, compassion, and empathy and compassion for others, for humankind in general. And the spirit of the East that he was talking about was very similar, was aligned to this in spirit, and that is why women. And they obviously faced, even in Japanese society, restrictions and problems. So the women were more receptive to Tagore's ideas. Moreover, we know that the school where he spent his time in the mountain resort, the children, mainly girls, were very, very interested in what he had to say, and they appreciated his speech, appreciated his ideas about the East, and understood the critique and could relate to his critique of the West.
Thank you so much. That was very helpful.
Dr. Banerjee, if I may ask you a question. You make the point at the end of your lecture that East stood for peace, amity, spirituality. This is Tagore's belief, and it seems to me that you are also endorsing it. But isn't this, more of a construct that came into existence uh, from the 19th century onward and crystallized in the 20th century in response to the Western domination of the rest of the world? Because if we look at the history of the world, it becomes very obvious, quite apart from whether or not there is one East and one West. The most important thing that comes out is that as far as warfare, violence, etc., are concerned, they are not the preserve of any one civilization or any one country. For example, the places which might be described as the East produced great warriors. In the medieval period, you can take the examples of Genghis Khan, Timur, so many others. So, and again, when we talk about amity between countries, I'm afraid, we can find numerous examples of wars between countries, within countries, those countries which might be described as Eastern countries. And as far as the spirituality is concerned, again, don't you think that because it was the West that argued that Eastern civilizations have failed to progress and they have, failed to sort of achieve modern industrialization and modern development. They are basically spiritual civilizations. But if we look at history, it becomes very clear that India was both spiritual and materialistic. It had made commendable progress in both the fields. So, what are your thoughts on this?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. Yes, I try actually, even when I was reading it, I don't know whether it was clear, but I was trying to say that this concept of one Asia is definitely not valid, and the because as we see Japan, I mean today China is attacking others, Japan attacked others, so it is a question of globalization. But yes, you're right. Even during the earlier period, 16th, 17th century, there were wars in the East. And apart from that, the whole concept of spiritualism, a spiritual East and a material West that Tagore is talking about, he has got it at the beginning of the paper. I tried to show how this was a common thought during the period. As you see, Swami Vivekananda said that, my sister Nivedita had said that, other people like I mean, the Brahmo activists were saying that. So this was something he had imbibed from them, but there is some truth in it because, as Okakura Kakuzo show and others showed, that there is a kind of, I mean, religious, I mean, there is a concept of one Asia because art, religion, spiritual, I mean, religions like Buddhism spread from India to other areas in Asia. So it is like these religious spiritual thoughts, and there is and even art which is related to spirituality in Japanese art or Chinese art, and this Buddhas, for instance. Okakura Kakuzo talked about that. So all these were common, and they were more common. I mean, they were more um, allied to Asian or at least South Asian countries. And so they were at one time one part of one big landmass where people used to interact with each other. They had similarities in viewpoints, in not only spirituality, even social customs. As I think I tried to make that clear. So at the same time, yes, because most of us have been colonies, so we were lagging behind in science. But yes, in the ancient period, India also had made a lot of progress in science. And actually, Ukakura talked about that. I couldn't because I thought that I would lose time, so I did not read out that part.
That's all right.
So it is difficult to say that, it is difficult to categorize like that. But there is this concept of, peace, amity, and of the nations, which is prevailing in Asia, was prevailing in Asia, at least Southeast Asia at that time. Again, there are exceptions, Japan. But at that time, and this is what is enduring now. But even in the West, as we saw, Roma Rola and other pacifists agreed with, I mean, Tagore wholesale, and they also try to cultivate that spirit. And even he
That's
found that in
precisely the, yeah.
among
Dr.
the other
Banerjee, this
European
is
countries. Yes, sir.
Dr. Banerjee, this is precisely the point I have been trying to make, that it was the West which decided that, what will be the discourse. And of course, in the West, there were pacifists and very important writers, intellectuals who thought like this. And in India, of course, there were Orientalists who basically, can be called the progenitors of this idea. And this idea then, of course, is spread through the society. I agree with you that there are certain things which can be cited, religion and some forms of art, etc. Anyway, we will carry on this discussion. I'm very, very thankful for you to agreeing, for agreeing to give this lecture. And I thank all members of the audience also. Thank you very much.
May I ask you one question, please?
Yes,
Nandita
who is this?
Nandita
Yes,
Bas.
please go ahead.
Actually, the slides are not visible in the screen, so there was a little problem.
Oh
Anyway,
no, I'm so sorry. I told them to.
There was
anyway,
some problem. There
Actually,
was
they
some
told
problem.
me that it would be better to. I mean, Nehru Memorial told me they would be able to turn on the slides.
Yes, please go ahead. Ask your question quickly. Yes.
it seems that what Tagore proposed in Japan and Japanese, there are some differences with the audience. What Tagore wanted to propose,
Okay.
but later on, After
Yeah.
all this warfare, I am asking you this question, whether, Japanese people, they revisited to Tagore's idea, what Tagore proposed in the earlier in 20s and, late 20s.
Yes, certainly. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, go on, please. I did. Yes, please.
Yes, yes. Please answer the question, Dr.
No,
Banerjee.
No,
Go
I
ahead.
think she had more to say. Could you?
no,
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 no.
no.
This is my
Oh, okay.
question.
This is her question.
Hmm.
Okay, I was just trying to say yes. Initially, there were a lot of enthusiasts who agreed with, as we know that even there was so much of interchange between Shantiniketan and Japan, and scholars came from there. A lot of people agreed with Tagore. Okakura Kakuzu definitely his concept of One Asia is something Tagore is praising there. Although his second book is a little different, but I don't want to go into that. But the ideals of the East is definitely very similar to ideas are very similar to what Tagore is saying. So there are many people who agreed with Tagore, but at the same time, generally the view is that Tagore had a very good interaction with the Japanese and they all loved him. That that view is not really acceptable, because there were also a sizable section who misunderstood Tagore, thought he was against science, and who disagreed with Tagore, saying that actually this is material advancement is necessary, and he was a traditionalist and he was no good. So it's only a certain proportion of the population, not everybody. A lot of people appreciated and were very receptive to Tagore's ideas.
Thank you very much, Dr. Banerjee.
Thank you.